What if a single moment, one decision could cost you everything? This is the story of Olivia Hart, a flight attendant who thought she had all the power, until she made a mistake that would destroy her career in the blink of an eye. The Boeing 787 sat calmly on the tarmac, its engines humming softly as passengers began boarding. Inside, the first-class cabin exuded luxury. Plush leather seats, ambient lighting, and the subtle scent of premium wood mixed with a hint of high-end cologne. The atmosphere was serene, an exclusive retreat for those who could afford it. Alexander Cole stepped into the first-class section, carrying a modest leather travel bag. At 39 years old, he was a man of wealth and power, but not the type to flaunt it. Dressed in a simple button-down shirt and well-fitted jeans, he blended in effortlessly, looking more like a seasoned traveler than the owner of the airline itself. His sharp blue eyes scanned the cabin with quiet observance, but his expression remained neutral, almost unreadable. As he approached his seat 2A, he set his bag down and smoothly slid it under the seat in front of him. The first-class chair was spacious, its leather cool against his back as he adjusted himself. This was a rare luxury for him. Despite having the means to fly privately, he often chose commercial flights for the convenience and anonymity. He wasn't here to make an impression. He was here to rest. Outside the window, the busy runway stretched into the distance, with ground crew moving efficiently between aircraft. Alexander let out a slow breath, enjoying the fleeting moment of peace before takeoff. He reached for the seatbelt, fastening it with an easy click, then leaned back, allowing himself to momentarily escape the pressures of his empire. But his moment of calm was about to be shattered. A shadow fell over him. "Sir, I need to check your ticket," a firm voice interrupted. Alexander turned his head to find Olivia Hart, the senior flight attendant, standing beside him. At 36 years old, Olivia was a seasoned professional. She had sharp features, piercing hazel eyes, and a no-nonsense posture. She had handled hundreds of first-class flights, dealt with every type of passenger, and prided herself on maintaining strict order in her cabin. However, there was something about her tone, not just professionalism, but doubt. Alexander didn't react immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out the boarding pass, and handed it over without a word. Olivia took it but barely glanced at it before raising an eyebrow. "This is for first class," she stated, her voice tinged with skepticism. "Yes," Alexander replied evenly. A brief silence stretched between them. Olivia's lips pressed into a thin line as she studied him, not the ticket, him. Something in her expression hardened. "Are you sure this wasn't issued to you by mistake?" she asked, her tone shifting from formal to pointedly doubtful. Nearby, a few passengers subtly turned their heads, sensing the shift in energy. Some chose to pretend not to listen, while others watched with quiet curiosity. Alexander exhaled slowly, maintaining his composure. "No mistake," he said. "I purchased it myself." But Olivia wasn't convinced. She let out a small, impatient sigh, her fingers tightening slightly around the boarding pass. "Right," she said, her tone clipped. "I just need to confirm something in our system. Please step aside while I handle this." A tense pause followed. For a moment, Alexander simply observed her, as if deciding how much of a reaction this situation warranted. Then, without a word, he unbuckled his seatbelt, stood up, and stepped aside. His presence was quiet but firm, a contrast to the dismissive authority in Olivia's tone. Passengers in the first-class section carefully avoided eye contact, pretending they hadn't noticed what was happening. But the moment Alexander left his seat, the energy in the cabin shifted and unspoken tension settled into the air. Olivia gestured for him to follow her toward the galley, where she picked up the in-flight phone and punched in a code. She spoke in a lower voice, but Alexander still caught the irritation in her tone. After a moment, she turned back to him with an exaggerated smile, the kind that wasn't real. "There seems to be an issue with your booking," she said smoothly. "We can offer you a seat in economy while we sort this out." Alexander's jaw tensed slightly, but his voice remained calm. "There is no issue. My ticket is valid." Her forced smile thinned. "Sir, I don't want to repeat myself. Please take your things and move to economy." A ripple of quiet murmurs spread through the economy section as passengers started noticing the situation. Heads lifted, eyes followed him, some filled with curiosity, others with silent judgment. But no one spoke up. Alexander looked at Olivia for a long moment. He could see it in her face. She had already decided that he didn't belong here. No matter what he said. No matter what his ticket said, she had made up her mind. Without another word, he turned, walked back to his seat, and reached for his carry-on. He pulled it from the overhead bin, slid the strap over his shoulder, and began walking down the aisle toward economy. The weight of dozens of stairs followed him, but still no one said a word. Alexander lowered himself into an empty seat in economy, his movements controlled, deliberate. The space was tighter, the seat rougher, but that wasn't what bothered him. It was the humiliation. His fingers hovered over his phone for a moment before he finally typed a message. Boarded. Got moved to economy. Flight attendant refused to check my ticket properly. He hit send. A few seconds later, his phone vibrated with a reply. What do you mean they moved you? Alexander's gaze flickered toward the front of the plane where Olivia continued her duties. Unaware of the mistake she had just made, another message appeared on his screen. Give me the flight number. He typed it in. A long pause. Then finally, a final message came through. Sit tight. This isn't over. Alexander leaned back in the cramped economy seat, his fingers resting on his phone screen as he stared out the small window. The hum of the engine filled the cabin. But his mind was elsewhere. He had spent his life teaching respect, fairness, and patience, yet just now he had been dismissed without question, without hesitation, as if he were invisible. The first-class passengers, the ones who had watched him be escorted away, had gone back to their conversations, their drinks, their comfort. No one had spoken up. No one had asked if he needed help. His phone buzzed again. Who was the attendant? Alexander sighed, rubbing his temple before typing back. Didn't catch her first name. Last name on her tag was Hart. The reply came almost instantly. Noted. Alexander exhaled, his fingers tapping lightly against the phone screen. He had no idea what was happening on the other end of that conversation, but he trusted it. Meanwhile, at the front of the plane, Olivia Hart poured herself a quick cup of coffee. She had no idea who she had just humiliated, and by the time she realized her mistake, it would already be too late. Olivia Hart stood in the galley, sipping her coffee with an air of confidence. To her, this was just another day, another flight, another passenger trying to sit where they didn't belong. She had encountered plenty of them before, people who thought they could talk their way into first class, act entitled, or make a scene. She had handled them all, and today was no different. But this time it was different. She just didn't know it yet. A few feet away, Sienna Carter, a younger flight attendant, hesitated before speaking. Was there an issue with that man's ticket? She asked, keeping her voice careful. Olivia let out a small dismissive laugh and shook her head. He was sitting in first class, she said with a pointed look, as if that explained everything. Sienna frowned slightly. Yeah, but you saw him. He wasn't causing trouble. And he didn't even argue when you moved him. He just... Olivia rolled her eyes, taking another sip of her coffee. Look, it's probably a mistake in the system. Or maybe someone gave him a ticket he wasn't supposed to have. Either way, I wasn't about to let him stay up there when it was obvious he didn't belong. Sienna's stomach twisted. Something didn't sit right about this. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Captain Rowan Hughes received an urgent message over the airline's internal communication system. His sharp eyes scanned the screen, and as soon as he read the name attached to the inquiry, his entire demeanor changed. He turned to his co-pilot, voice low and serious. Pull up the passenger manifest. Now. The co-pilot, sensing the tension, didn't question the order. A few taps on the screen, and the list of passengers appeared before them. Names scrolled past until Captain Hughes saw it. Alexander Cole. His pulse quickened. He read the details twice, making sure he wasn't mistaken. Then his gaze flickered back to the urgent message on his screen. The request was crystal clear. Confirm immediately if Alexander Cole has been removed from first class. The co-pilot glanced at Hughes, frowning. Wait, you don't mean the Alexander Cole, do you? Captain Hughes didn't answer right away. He was already reaching for the in-flight phone, his jaw tight as he dialed the lead flight attendant's line. A few seconds later, Olivia's voice came through, light and unconcerned. This is Hart. Miss Hart, Captain Hughes said, keeping his tone even but with a weight behind it that hadn't been there before. I need to confirm something. Did you remove a first-class passenger named Alexander Cole? There was a brief pause on the other end. Then Olivia's voice returned, still confident, still certain she was right. "Yes, Captain," she said. "His ticket didn't match first-class status, so I had him moved to economy." Captain Hughes's grip on the phone tightened slightly. "Did you verify his ticket?" he asked. There was a beat of silence, just long enough to be noticeable. Then Olivia let out a small laugh, the kind people give when they think they're being questioned over nothing. "Captain, I've been working flights for over a decade. I can tell when someone doesn't belong in first class." A longer pause this time. Then Captain Hughes spoke again, but his voice had changed, colder now, more precise. "Miss Hart," he said. "Do you know who Alexander Cole is?" Silence. The kind of silence that stretches too long, that hangs thick in the air, that signals something is very, very wrong. Captain Hughes didn't wait for her to answer. "Alexander Cole is the owner of this airline." The phone line went completely dead. And for the first time since the flight began, Olivia Hart felt something she had never felt before: panic. Olivia Hart stood frozen in the galley, her grip tightening on the in-flight phone. Her heart pounded so hard she could hear it in her ears. The silence on the other end of the call felt suffocating. The words "owner of this airline" echoed in her mind, but she couldn't process them. It couldn't be true. She had removed Alexander Cole, the man who controlled her paycheck, her career, her entire professional future, from first class, and humiliated him in front of an entire cabin of passengers. A cold wave of realization crashed over her. There had to be some mistake. He didn't look like the owner of an airline. He wasn't wearing a tailored suit, wasn't flashing an expensive watch, didn't have that entitled arrogance that so many wealthy passengers carried. He had just sat there, quietly. Olivia swallowed hard, her mind racing for a way out. She turned sharply toward Sienna Carter, who had been watching her with wide, knowing eyes. "Did you know about this?" Olivia demanded, her voice sharper than intended. Sienna blinked, taken aback. "Of course not," she said. "But maybe you should have checked his ticket before assuming." The word stung, because deep down Olivia knew Sienna was right. Before she could respond, the overhead intercom crackled to life. "Miss Hart," Captain Hughes' voice rang through the cabin, no longer just professional but edged with command. "You are to immediately escort Mr. Cole back to his original first-class seat. Upon landing, you are to report directly to the executive team for a formal review of this incident." Passengers in economy and first class alike had already sensed that something unusual was happening, but now they were all watching. A wave of murmurs rippled through the plane. Those who had been quietly observing now exchanged knowing glances, whispering among themselves. Olivia's stomach dropped. This wasn't just an internal matter anymore. She was being ordered publicly to correct her mistake. She turned, feeling every set of eyes on her, and made her way down the aisle toward economy. The moment Olivia entered economy class, the energy in the cabin changed. She felt it immediately, that shift from in control to exposed. Passengers who had witnessed Alexander's forced removal now watched with keen interest, their eyes flickering between her and the man she had dismissed so easily. Some looked smug, as if justice was being served. Others simply waited, eager to see how this would unfold. She reached row 23, where Alexander Cole sat in a cramped economy seat, gazing out the window as if none of this concerned him. For a moment, Olivia hesitated. Everything inside her wanted to hold on to what little authority she had left. But she knew she had none. Taking a breath, she forced a tight, professional smile and spoke, her voice quieter than before. "Mr. Cole," she said, her usual confidence nowhere to be found. "There has been a misunderstanding. I'd like to escort you back to first class." Alexander finally turned to face her. His calm blue eyes locked onto hers, but his expression remained unreadable. "A misunderstanding?" he repeated, his tone neutral. Olivia's hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Yes," she said quickly. "I regret the error. Please allow me to assist you back to your original seat." A few passengers stopped pretending not to listen. They had seen everything before, but now they were seeing something new. The powerful flight attendant who had once stood so firm was now backtracking. Alexander didn't move. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his voice still calm but firm. "Why?" Olivia blinked. "Excuse me. Why are you moving me back now?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. "Earlier, you seemed quite sure I didn't belong there." A few quiet gasps escaped from nearby passengers. Olivia's throat went dry. She started, but she had no answer. Alexander let the silence stretch between them. His expression wasn't angry, wasn't mocking, but it was steady. And he was waiting. Olivia shifted, suddenly uncomfortable. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and everyone around them knew it. Finally, Alexander sighed and rose from his seat. The moment he did, the tension in the cabin shifted. Passengers straightened in their chairs, some exchanging quiet, knowing glances. Olivia exhaled, relieved that he wasn't going to push it further. She quickly stepped aside, gesturing for him to follow her back to first class. But just as she turned, Alexander spoke again. And this time, not to her, but to the cabin of watching passengers. Funny, he mused, his tone light but pointed, how I was told to move so quickly. But when it was time to fix the mistake, that took a little longer. A ripple of unease spread through the economy section. Some passengers nodded subtly, agreeing. Others looked away, suddenly uncomfortable with the truth now sitting right in front of them. Olivia didn't respond. She just walked stiffly ahead, leading him back to first class and feeling the weight of every single stare following her. When Alexander took his original seat, he adjusted his bag without acknowledging Olivia at all. She stood beside him, her uniform suddenly feeling too tight, her presence too small. If there's anything you need, Mr. Cole, she said, grasping for professionalism, please let me know. Alexander slowly turned to her. You didn't ask me that before, he said simply. The words hit like a slow, deliberate punch. Because he was right. She had greeted every other first-class passenger with warmth and courtesy. She had offered them drinks, adjusted their seats, made sure they were comfortable. But not him. She had walked right up to his seat, questioned him, and removed him without hesitation. She had spoken to him with doubt instead of courtesy, with suspicion instead of respect. The power shift was complete now. And for the first time in her career, Olivia Hart was the one being watched, judged, and held accountable. Her lips parted, but no words came out. She had never been in this position before, never been forced to explain herself. Alexander simply picked up the in-flight magazine and began flipping through the pages. And just like that, she no longer existed to him. That dismissal, not cruel, not aggressive, just indifferent, burned deeper than any argument ever could. Olivia's throat tightened. She turned quickly and walked back toward the galley, keeping her steps even, keeping her shoulders squared. She wouldn't let them see her break. But inside her hands were shaking. And she had never felt so small. The seatbelt sign dinged on, and the captain's voice echoed through the cabin, smooth and professional as always. Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent. Please make sure your seatbelts are fastened and your tray tables are in their upright positions. We will be landing shortly. The usual sounds of passengers adjusting their seats, fastening their belts, and preparing for arrival filled the air. But for Olivia Hart, none of it felt normal. She stood in the galley, her back pressed against the counter, breathing slowly, deliberately. The flight had taken just under 3 hours, but to her it had felt like a lifetime. The moment she had walked Alexander Cole back to his seat, the shift in power had been absolute. He hadn't yelled. He hadn't demanded her firing. He hadn't needed to. She knew what was waiting for her once the wheels touched the ground. Her fingers curled tightly around the edge of the counter as she tried to hold on to what little composure she had left. But there was no undoing what had happened. There were no second chances. A quiet voice broke through her thoughts. You really sweating this, huh? Olivia turned sharply. Sienna Carter stood at the entrance of the galley, arms crossed, watching her carefully. Olivia glared, her tone sharp. I don't need your input right now. Sienna smirked. I'm just saying, you don't look as confident as you did an hour ago. Olivia's jaw tightened. She had worked too hard for this position. She had been through too much to let one incident destroy everything she had built. But deep down she knew. This wasn't just one incident. This was a catastrophe. Sienna let out a small sigh, shaking her head. If you had just treated him like any other first-class passenger, none of this would be happening. The words cut deeper than Olivia wanted to admit. She wanted to argue. She wanted to say that she had followed protocol, that she had done what she thought was right. But even she didn't believe that anymore. The seatbelt sign dinged off and passengers stood stretching, gathering their things. For them, this was just another flight. For Olivia, it was the end of everything. She sat frozen in the galley, her fingers digging into the edge of the counter. She could hear passengers chattering, hear the usual shuffle of disembarkation, but it all felt distant, muted. Her eyes flickered toward the cabin door, where security and the executive team stood just beyond the glass. They weren't here for a random disturbance. They weren't here for an airport issue. They were here for her. She felt her stomach twist as she forced herself to her feet. The walk down the aisle felt endless. Every step was heavier than the last. Passengers who had seen what happened earlier now stole quick glances as she passed. Some watched with quiet satisfaction. Others simply looked away, as if witnessing the fall of someone who had once held power was too uncomfortable to acknowledge. She reached the exit, stepping through the threshold and into the harsh reality waiting for her. The airline executive spoke first. "Miss Hart," he said, his tone formal, clipped, carrying the weight of something final. "Come with us." She didn't argue. She didn't try to defend herself. Because for the first time in her life, she had nothing left to say. The airport corridors had never felt so cold. Olivia Hart walked with measured steps, flanked by security and the senior airline executive, her uniform perfectly pressed but meaningless now. Every corridor she passed felt unfamiliar, even though she had walked them 1,000 times before. She had once commanded authority here, once belonged here. Now, she was just another employee being escorted out. She was led into a small, sterile conference room, the walls bare, the air heavy with finality. 3 senior airline officials sat on the opposite side of the table, their expressions unreadable. They weren't managers. They weren't supervisors. These were the people who decided who stayed and who was removed. One of them, an older woman with steel gray hair and an icy demeanor, folded her hands on the table and spoke. "Miss Hart," she said, "have a seat." Olivia lowered herself into the chair, keeping her back straight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. No one spoke for a moment. Then, the gray-haired executive broke the silence. "Do you understand why you're here?" Olivia's mouth felt dry. She knew that whatever she said next would determine the rest of her career. She licked her lips, forcing her voice to remain steady. There was a misunderstanding about a passenger's status in first class. A second executive, a tall man with a sharp jawline, raised an eyebrow. "A misunderstanding?" he repeated. Olivia fought the urge to look away. "Yes," she continued, "I made a mistake in seating arrangements." The third executive, a bald man who had been reading over a report, finally looked up. "A mistake?" he repeated flatly. "Is that what you're calling it?" Silence. And suddenly she knew. They weren't here to hear her side of the story. They already had the facts. The reports had been filed. The statements had been gathered. Her actions had already been reviewed. And now, they were simply here to deliver the verdict. The gray-haired executive slid a piece of paper toward her. Her voice was calm and precise, like a judge passing sentence. "Effective immediately. You are relieved of your position as senior flight attendant." Olivia felt her stomach drop. "Your employment with this airline has been terminated." Her breath hitched. She wanted to speak, to argue, to fight back. But before she could, the second executive raised a hand, stopping her cold. "This decision is final," he said. "Your conduct on Flight 417 was unacceptable. You did not verify a first-class passenger's ticket. You acted based on assumption. And you publicly humiliated someone who had every right to be in the seat you forced him out of." The third executive leaned forward, his gaze unyielding. "And Miss Hart," he said, his voice lower, colder. "The passenger you humiliated was Alexander Cole." The weight of those words crushed any last hope she had. She had spent years making snap judgments. Years deciding who belonged and who didn't. And now, for the first time, she was the one being judged. And she had been found unworthy. Olivia stared at the termination letter, her eyes burning. 10 years. 10 years of flying. 10 years of experience. Gone. Because of one choice. One wrong choice. Her mind raced, grasping for a way out, for something she could say, for a chance to salvage what was left. But there was nothing. No second chances. No negotiation. Just the cold, brutal weight of accountability. The gray-haired executive stood, signaling the end of the meeting. "Security will escort you out." And just like that, it was over. She rose from her chair, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the termination letter. As she turned to leave, the third executive spoke one last time. Maybe next time, he said. His voice calm but sharp. Before you judge someone by their appearance, you'll think twice. Olivia didn't reply. She walked out of the room, her vision blurred, her body feeling heavier than it ever had before. Security opened the door for her, and as she stepped into the hallway, the reality of what had just happened finally hit her. For the first time in 10 years, she stepped out of the airport without a uniform, without a title, without a purpose. She wasn't staff anymore. She wasn't part of this world anymore. She was just another former employee walking toward an uncertain future. She pulled out her phone, fingers trembling, and scrolled through her contacts. She needed to call someone. A friend. A former colleague. Someone who could help. She needed to find a way back into the industry. Because if she didn't, she had nowhere else to go. She clicked on a contact. A former manager. She pressed call. The phone rang once. Twice. 3 times. Voicemail. She swallowed hard, then tried another contact. Voicemail. Then another. Voicemail. Her stomach twisted. They knew. They all knew. And no one was going to help her. A few yards away, a sleek black car sat parked near the private exit. Inside, Alexander Cole watched as Olivia stepped out, standing still on the sidewalk as if she didn't know where to go. Lucas, his assistant, checked his phone and looked up. She's out. Alexander didn't react right away. He just watched her. His face unreadable. Lucas hesitated. Do you think she learned anything from this? Alexander finally exhaled. I don't know, he admitted. Some people do. Some people don't. Lucas nodded. Do you think she deserved to be fired? Alexander didn't answer immediately. He wasn't a cruel man. He wasn't someone who enjoyed watching people lose everything. But this had never been about revenge. It had been about accountability. I think she deserved to know what it feels like, he said finally. To be dismissed without a second thought. Lucas didn't argue, because they both knew the truth. This wasn't just about Olivia Hart losing her job. It was about sending a message. That if you think you can judge people unfairly and walk away without consequences, think again. As the black car pulled away, Olivia Hart stood on the sidewalk, staring at nothing. She had spent her entire career making snap judgments about people. And today, the industry had made a snap judgment about her. And it had decided she didn't belong. In life, power and authority are fleeting. But the way we treat others stays with us forever. Olivia Hart learned this lesson too late, that a single moment of arrogance, a single assumption, can unravel everything you've built. How many times have people been judged not by their abilities, but by their appearance? How often do we dismiss others without truly seeing them? Alexander Cole didn't seek revenge, he sought accountability. And in the end, the greatest lesson Olivia received was not from a punishment, but from the realization that she had been wrong all along. This story isn't just about one woman losing her job, it's about how we carry power, how we use it, and how easily it can be taken away. Whether in the workplace, in customer service, or in everyday interactions, respect costs nothing, but its absence can cost everything. If you enjoyed this story and want more thought-provoking, powerful narratives, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. We bring you the best stories every week, ones that entertain, inspire, and remind us of the truths we sometimes forget. Let us know in the comments. Have you ever witnessed an unfair judgment like this? What would you have done in Alexander's place? And remember, next time you look at someone, don't judge too quickly, because you never know who you're really speaking to. See you in the next story. Ice sparkles.